welcome to Build a To-Do List app at warp speed. Before I get going here, let me poll the room, and I assume everyone here is doing some form of JavaScript. Is that true? I can see some nods. How about Node.js? Who here is doing Node.js development? Perfect. And when you do Node.js development, are you working with databases? And are you using SQL? Who here knows SQL? Perfect. You're a great crowd for this talk, so you'll see why I'm asking these questions. So now let me tell you a little bit about me. I'm Alex Roitman. I am the founder and CEO of Profound Logic. And actually, this year is a big year for us because we're celebrating 20 years of being in business. And when I first started the company back in like 1999, I wasn't, they say that most companies fail like within the first year, or like 50% of companies fail within the first 5 years. And you're always kind of thinking in the back of your head, well, what happens if this doesn't make the profit that I'm going for? Like, what if it doesn't work out? What am I going to do? Well, now that it's 20 years, I don't think I'm thinking that anymore. So this picture that I have here, that's me. That's not when I started the company, but this was actually a big day for me. This is me and my parents. And this is when I first got my first job in computers. And I was like 14 or 15 years old. And there's a whole other story about how I got that job. But I was really into computers at that age, and I was trying to learn everything about it. I didn't have a computer myself, but my brother, who was 7 years older than me, he had a computer, and I was always over at his place working with his computer and learning everything that I could about it. So I got this first job. And the unfortunate thing is that the first couple weeks actually weren't going very well, because my official job was of a computer operator. I was working for a transportation company in Ohio, in Dayton, Ohio. And my daily duties actually involved something along the lines of taking reports from printers and carrying them to the right departments and passing out reports, and feeding green bar paper into this big printer. I don't know if you guys know what green bar paper is. Maybe some of you know. So believe it or not, like this happened like a dozen times. My tie, and I don't have a picture in this, I don't have a tie in this picture, but my tie would actually get stuck in the printer all the time as I was trying to. So obviously I wasn't a hardware guy. But it turned out I was pretty good at software. So one day, this was actually just a couple weeks into the job, my boss, she called me into her office, and she said, I don't think this is really working out. You're not very good at what we've assigned for you to do, but I noticed that you're talking to the other people in our group that are developers, and you're really picking up coding very, very quickly. So I think what you should be doing is development. And so they made me a developer, and I was, like I said, I think 14 at the time, working with all the other developers. And the rest, as they say, is history. I really excelled at development. And at 19, I started Profound Logic, which is a legacy modernization company. And what that means is that we go in and work with older systems and bring in new technologies into these older systems. So that's basically what my story is, but let me tell you a little bit about what we do at Profound Logic. Well, we've had over 1,000 companies that we've helped out in the past 20 years, so I feel like that's pretty good success. And our typical customer is an IT professional, so they're other software developers. But these are not software developers that work at technology companies or software companies. Our typical customer is going to be an insurance company, and we have tons of insurance companies that are our customers, or transportation, logistics is another big industry that we're in. City and county governments and manufacturing are big ones for us. And this is not the full list, but this is primarily where we deal. And what we found is that the needs of these companies are quite different than those of developers at, let's say, Microsoft or Google or something like that. And we had to find ways to cater to those needs. When we work on a project, when we come into a company, there's already a lot of existing infrastructure. And that was one of the big challenges for us. So we're trying to introduce newer technologies such as browser-based or mobile interfaces or Node.js into these existing applications that maybe were built in the 90s. And what we found is that it wasn't really practical to just try to rebuild everything from scratch. And believe me, I've seen companies try, and I've seen lots of failures where the approach is, let's just throw everything away that we have and just rebuild everything. I've seen companies spend tens of millions of dollars and hundreds of millions of dollars on projects like this, only to find out that they're going down the wrong path, and maybe they've only modernized like 10 or 15% of their system, and just to realize that we got to cut our losses and go back to the old system. So the typical organization that we'll work with will have already in place millions of lines of code, typically legacy code, hundreds, but even more typical, thousands of employees that are internal users of these applications. And the applications are going to have thousands of screens or pages if these are browser-based applications. So we really had to, just to get the business from these companies, we had to look for patterns to simplify the process. So we had to come up with systems or a system that would make development 10 times more productive to modernize these applications, so that when we come in, it doesn't take 10 years to modernize one of these big applications. It takes maybe less than a year to do that. And so the purpose of this session here is just for me to show you some of what we discovered and some of these methodologies that we've put to use. Now the funny thing is that if you look at software development back in the 90s, in many ways it was actually much simpler than it is today. And I can understand why that would be, because there's a lot more complexity today when you work with like browser applications and web servers compared to like a simple desktop application. But in my view, development tools and methodologies should really keep up, and you shouldn't have to do 10 times the amount of work today compared to what you did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I brought up an example of like VB6. I don't know if you guys know what that is. Maybe not the best tool, but it became very popular because it was simple for people to pick up and do simple things with, and design screens with, and go out and get to a database. Whereas if you compare it to today's developers that are doing, let's say, Node.js development, oftentimes they're dealing with web servers. So for example, if you're building an Express application, and they're dealing with, they have to understand what an event loop is, and asynchronous programming and callbacks. Those are all complexities that, as I mentioned before, if you're working at Google or Microsoft, or maybe you're like a Netflix that's trying to optimize video streaming, you do need to know all of this, and you do need to go to that low level. But if you're, let's say, an insurance company or a transportation company, you're really trying to get down to the business logic. You have certain needs within the business, and you want to get that solved, and you don't want to be coding a web server from scratch. So in my view, how it should be is that when you're building an application, user interfaces should be simple to build. And that, to me, means that within an organization, you got to decide on some standards on what your client-side HTML, JavaScript, and CSS would be. And you're just building those pre-built standards as components or widgets into your applications. And so you're not reinventing the wheel every time. When it comes to business logic, typically you want it to be top-down. And by that I mean that you're not dealing with things like callbacks or callback hell. Who here has heard of callback hell and what that means? So, and there are ways that Node and JavaScript solves these problems with things like promises or async await. But in my view, even that, you shouldn't have to be, as a business developer. It's great if you know about this stuff, but you shouldn't have to think about it and deal with it as you're coding applications. So you don't want callback hell, you don't want promises hell, you don't want async await hell. The other thing is that every single one of our customers has a database behind their applications. And so when it comes to databases, I feel like database connectivity should just be inherent to your framework. So what we did to accomplish this for our customers, and this is what our typical customer will use to both build and maintain their applications, is first, when it comes to building user interfaces, they'll typically use a design tool. And sometimes they'll get into the HTML and the CSS, but often they'll use pre-built widgets that they're just dragging onto a user interface canvas, and they're just kind of mocking things up. When it comes to building the code, they're not writing a web server from scratch. There's kind of a built-in web server that's in place. Authentication is standardized. And even though it uses Express underneath it all, our typical customer is actually not coding all the roots in Express and all of that stuff. So we keep the async nature of JavaScript for our customers because that's important. JavaScript is asynchronous, which is great because that's how applications scale. That's why they perform well. But we make it so that you, as a developer that's building business applications, you don't have to deal with that. And we also simplify database access with API, kind of like standard API that allows you to access any database. So these are some of the things that we've done for our customers. But late last year, we realized that all of these tools that we're building for our customers could actually be used by the Node.js and JavaScript community at large. And we launched a website, a free website called noderun.com, which is a playground for full stack development. And a good way for me to describe it, if you've ever heard of something like CodePen or JS Fiddle, I'm seeing some nods. So those are great kind of playground sites for front-end developers and designers. And this is more for full stack development. So where you've got databases and you're running server-side code alongside client-side code. So it's a playground that has the IDE and, more importantly, a runtime environment, so you can actually run and test and do POCs and just play around with server-side code. And when we build our to-do list application today, we're going to use this playground as an environment. And by the way, the way that this session is structured, I'm giving this quick talk here, and the rest of it is going to be hands-on. We're going to actually build a to-do list application, and we're going to do it very quickly because of some of the tools that we're exploring here. So let me talk about Node.run spaces. So when you go to noderun.com, you get your own space, and this happens immediately. So as soon as you visit the site, you get your own space, and that, before you even sign up for anything, you get this space, and that means it's your own Linux container with full access to it. You can install anything you want. So if you wanted to play with an NPM package, you can go ahead and play with it. And if you wanted to discard that work, throw it away. If you've built something interesting, you can actually save it, send it to a friend. So you get your own Linux container, you get your own files, you get your own database. Database is already there and set up for you. You don't have to configure anything. And there's already kind of a built-in Express server that's kind of configured, and you can start building applications very quickly. So this concept of spaces is very important, and the fact that they're instantly created and easy to dispose of. As a user, you can have as many of these spaces as you want. It's not like one user gets one space. You just play around as much as you want. As an IDE, so this environment gives you pretty much all the tools that you would need to use to do Node.js development. Now, you can always download that code to your VS Code environment, but a lot of this is already set up. That's why it's so friendly. So there are templates that you can pick from, or you can start from scratch. There's this concept of widget sets, and we're going to play around with it a little bit, which is front-end components that you can use in your application. As far as a code editor, obviously we had to provide a code editor. And everyone loves VS Code, and we're pretty much giving you the code editor from VS Code. If you've ever heard of the Monaco project, the Monaco editor is basically the editor that they use with VS Code. That's the open source component of it. But the cool thing is that you can not just code the apps, because you can do that lots of other places, but what's unique, and this is kind of like the first of its kind out there, is that you can run these applications directly on the site. You can debug both client-side and server-side code, and you can view active sessions. What that means is that if you create a quick little app, you send it to a bunch of your friends, you can see who's logging on and who's using that application. You get a browser-based terminal, and that would be useful, like if you wanted to install something different on that environment. And obviously, you can install NPM packages. So that's the environment. There's also a social component to it, meaning that you can share your applications. You can share your application with an end user, but you can also share your application with another developer that can look at your code, give you kind of pointers or whatever, and you can share these widgets if you are creating widgets, or you could be using other users' widgets. There's a concept of contributors. Contributors just means I can invite another user to work together with me on one space. That's all that it means. You can comment on spaces. You can fork a space. Just means you create a copy, and it's your own project now. So that's all of that is there now, but we're also building something that's coming soon, and that is what we internally call a community site, which is just a way for developers to showcase their work, although most users will probably use it as a way to find other people's work and see what they're doing, but also maybe use that code in their own project. So let's say if you wanted to build an e-commerce site, you'll be able to go out there and see who else has built an e-commerce site that maybe I can use as a starting point, and what kind of database did they use, and so forth. So that's the idea of the community site. That's not there, but within a month or so, we plan to launch this community site. So before we get into actually building a live application, I wanted to talk about what type of development can you do on NodeRun.com. And you can do, obviously, this is all about full stack JavaScript. So it's Node.js and JavaScript. We don't do PHP or any of the other things. I'm a big believer in JavaScript and Node.js being kind of like the technology of the future. So that's what this environment is all about. But in terms of what you use within the site, you can just kind of use it as a hosting place that can run your applications and not use any of the other utilities and tools. So kind of like embrace all the tools and the API to the max, or do none of it at all, or something in the middle, because there's different things that you can draw upon. The other thing that we have is the ability to do stateful applications versus stateless. And so the difference between those is a stateful application is driven by server-side code, or the flow of the application is driven by server-side code, versus a stateless application, the flow is driven by client-side code, and it just kind of makes requests to the server side. And the stateful concept, even though it's a little different than your typical paradigm, it actually, in certain cases, especially business application development, has a lot of advantages. And that's what I'm going to show you today when we build our to-do list application. And the way that we're going to build this to-do list application is not like the only way to do it, but it's just one way, and you'll see that we can do it quickly. All right, so with that, we are ready to start building the application. There's going to be 3 phases to this, and each one of them I think is going to take about 5 to 10 minutes. We're going to design the user interface. We're going to write the code to list, add, and remove to-do list items. And then the third phase will be to connect all of that to a database, a live database. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to start up a browser, Google Chrome, and just go to NodeRun.com. And if you want to follow along, you can. And it comes up with a bunch of templates, but in this exercise, we're just going to be building from scratch. So you can actually click the little X to come out of that. And if you're trying to use this on a phone, I don't know how far you'll be able to get once we start coding. Yeah, just saying. Okay. All right. So One of the very first thing that you'll see is that there's this canvas where you can start designing a screen. And that's where we're going to start. We're going to start building a user interface. And you can switch over to widget sets. And you can see that this already comes with a bunch of these widgets that you can start with. And I'm going to grab a grid component. So a grid component, put that on the screen. There's the ability to resize these columns and kind of control how many columns there are. So I'm going to remove one of the columns, because in this exercise we're only going to have 2 columns, and then resize just using my mouse. And I'm going to double click to give these headers a heading. So the first one is going to be action. This next one is going to be item. And the way that the grid works is that you can put other components within it. So we're going to put an output field in the item component, and then I can double click it, and it gives me this, what we call a binding dialog, and I can actually assign a field name that will be kind of propagated to my Node.js script. And so we're going to call this item, and the data type that we'll select is going to be varying character, and the maximum length will be 50. Click OK. And then under action, we'll put a button on there. And technically, it doesn't matter which button you grab. I grabbed what's labeled here as the cancel button, but I can double click and type over it, and I'm going to type remove. So that's going to be our remove button. So that sets up our grid. And next, let's set up a way to add items. And we can do that just by putting a label over here that says new item. So I dragged over a label, new item. Double click that and type in new item. And then right beside it, we'll put a text box. And I'll double click that, and we'll actually give it a field name of new item. This is also a character varying field with a max length of 50. And we'll add a button right next to this, and I'll change the button to say add. So one of the things that you can do with this grid, and these are kind of optional steps that you can take, but the grid itself is a component that has lots of capabilities, and you can modify them in this properties window. So you can make sure that the grid is selected, and you can go to the properties window and find all kinds of properties. And so I'm just going to illustrate just a couple of them. So I'm going to select sortable columns. I'm going to select that to true. And we'll do export XLXX export. That's an Excel export, so we'll set that to true. So all that we're saying is that we're enabling these capabilities automatically on this grid. And there's other things that you can do here, like you can do filtering and searching. But just to illustrate that the grid itself is a component that has lots of features built in. Our next step here is to give these components some names. And these are the names that are, again, they're propagated to the Node.js code. So we're going to click on the screen, click Edit, and we're going to call this toScreen. And I misspelled it. Obviously, the spelling is going to be important. These names are going to be important, and the case is going to be important. So toScreen for that one. And the grid, we can just call that a grid. And the final thing that we'll do is for each one of these buttons, you can assign what we call a response. And that is, again, another field or variable that is communicated to the Node.js code. So I'm going to go to the response property, click the little icon that says bind response, and that gives me the binding dialog. And so for add, we're going to add it to a Boolean field called add. Whereas for remove, and you got to click it on the first row here, and then go to the response. we're going to give it a field name of remove. So at this point, we've pretty much configured our user interface, and that first phase is complete. So we've built, and I don't know if this is the prettiest of them all. A lot of modifications could be made here, but it's a functional, as far as the UI goes, to be able to add, list, and remove items from a to-do list. So I'm going to go ahead and click Save. And when I come up with the Save dialog, it's basically prompting me for a file name, and I'm just going to call this to-do. And you'll see that the extension is automatically, like if you tab off of it, it's a JSON file. It's creating a JSON representation of the user interface for us. So I'll go ahead and click Save. And if I switch over to the Files tab, you can see that in my workspace files, there's now a to-do.json file. So we're now done with that phase one of building the user interface. And what I'm going to do now is select New, JavaScript file. And this allows us to write some JavaScript or Node.js code to interface with that file. So I'm going to call this, there's a function that it sorts for you. I'm going to call this function to do. It doesn't matter what you call this function. Now here's some of the built-in functionality that comes into play. I'm going to set exports run equals to do. And this exported name of run just tells me like which function makes this the runnable, which function do I run when I launch this space, so to speak. So it's this to do function that I'll launch. The next thing is let me refer to the screen that I've built. And for that, we have some APIs, some profound JS APIs. So I'm going to type in pjs define display. And there are two parameters to it. First is the name of an object. We'll call this display. And then second is the name of the JSON file that we created. So what we've done here is we've created an object called display that has all of the definitions for our screen that we've created, including this statement also brings in all of the like add, remove, and all of the listing capabilities are automatically brought in. So the next thing that we'll do is type in display dot to do screen, and to do screen, if you recall, we're referring back to the name that we gave to the screen. We call it to do screen, and then we have this method called execute that allows us to run that screen. So after doing that, this is enough code to show the screen. So we're going to stop here and just go ahead and save, and I'm going to call this todo.js. Click Save. So one last step here before we kind of publish and run the application is you can right-click the todo.js file in your file tree and select Properties. And you can see that there's a few options that you can set here. So you can set this app start file, and that's what we want to do. Like if we wanted to make this a web service, there's another option for that, but this is actually just how we're launching the application. So just simply select the app start file, click OK, and at this point you should be able to click the publish button to publish your application as a runnable space. So when you click publish, what you may see, if you're not signed up yet, you may see something like this. I'm going to sign out. When you click publish, you may see something like this. And you'd either have to sign up or click something like log in with GitHub if you have a GitHub account. So I'm going to just log in with GitHub. And once you're logged in, it's going to ask you for a workspace name. So we can call this something like a to-do list. And you can call it the same. And you can give it a description if you want. This is optional. You can see there's some public permissions that I can specify. Am I allowing other users to see the space, run the space, all kinds of things here. So let's just say my first space, something like that. And I'll click Publish. And when I do that, it gives me some URLs. So these are URLs that I can share with others in order to be able to run this application. So I can open all of the code with this URL, just alex/todo, or I can run the application with this URL, /run/alex/todo. Another way to get to this is you can go to the Launch menu, and you can say Launch App in Browser tab. And at this point, that's when I run the application, this is all that I'll see, but there's no functionality there yet. There's no code to list anything or anything like that. So the next step here would be to add the functionality to list the items and then add and remove the items. So let's close out of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an array called list. And within this array, I'll have a few objects or items. And the property that I'm using is item. And you can see that that matches to what I have in my grid. So let's say we'll do something like item go shopping. And you can make up your own. And you put in as many items as you want. I'll just maybe put in a couple. So just a standard array of items. And once we have this built, what I can do is I can use a method. So display.grid .replace records, and then pass in list. So this replace records method just says, go to my grid on the screen and feed in that list of records. So this part of it is, this replace records is part of Node Run. And so the define display and anything that you do with display is part of Node Run. And so you don't necessarily have to use these API, but we're trying to make the development of user interfaces and this interaction easier. And so that's what we're providing. So I'm going to go ahead and click Save. And go ahead and launch my app in my browser tab. And I should just see the items that I fed in. And obviously, this is just a hard-coded list. Just to start, it's a hard-coded list of items. We'll get to how I can fetch that from a database in a couple of steps. But now I see my list of items. So the next step here is to put in the capability to add items and remove items. So if I wanted to add an item, so let's close out of this. And this is the part that's the stateful part of this. And if you've never done coding like this may look a little strange. But what I'm basically going to say is that when I show my screen, I want to put it into a continuous loop. And I'm going to continue to show that screen until there's something that allows me to exit, or maybe the user just closes my application. So I can actually do a loop that says, while true, keep on executing this screen. And this looks a little strange because it appears as if it's an infinite loop. But it truly pauses when it executes the screen and waits for the user to respond. And if the user closes the browser session, that just kills my entire job, so to speak. And so that's why this infinite loop is not truly an infinite loop. So we'll add that in there so that the screen is constantly being redisplayed as the user interacts with the application. And then we'll do this statement. So if add. And this right here is interesting because, like, you may wonder where does add come from? And you remember that we added a response field that we called add on the user interface side. And when we put in this PJS defined display statement right here, that brought all of that in. And so those are now fields that are declared within this function. So I can say if add, and that just means the user clicked add. So if add, I can do something like display.grid.push. And push is a method that adds an item to the grid. And we can do item. And then value would be new item. And now new item is also coming from the screen, directly from the screen. So just that one line of code allows me to add items to the screen. So I'm going to just one line of code. I told you this was going to be at warp speed. So If I'm going to go in here and let's just add, let's say, pick up the kids and click the add button, that appears in my list. So now that's in there. And of course, I can be adding more items in there. But let's move on and let's work on the remove. And the remove functionality also, I believe, is all that it takes is one line of code, but I kind of have to explain a little bit. So you have a remove button on every line item of the grid. So you really have to process the entire grid and see which flags, which one of the records have the remove flag tagged on or set to true. So an easy way to do that is to run what we call an apply filter method. And it looks something like this. So you say display.grid apply filter. And here you can use ES6 syntax and an arrow function. So you could say an entry or a record in the grid, and you can basically filter it out and say, just keep the ones that don't have the remove flag. So this line of code, this simple line of code, basically says, go through my grid, and anytime there's a remove flag, filter that out, but keep the rest. So that, again, just one line of code. And what that gives us is the ability to click remove on any one of these, and they just go away. And if I add, something, and let's just kind of add, let's say hello, that goes in there, and then I can remove it. So both the ability to add items to the list and remove items to the list have been added. I want to show you one more thing here, is that the fact that I can actually click on any one of the columns in the grid and sort it, that's just built into the grid, or things like being able to export to Excel is built into the grid simply through the virtue of me setting those flags on. So there's the exported list. So this is all nice, but obviously we're not connected to the database. So if I refresh this, all of my work is gone. And so the next step will be to connect this to a database. So we're now ready to move on to phase 3, which is connecting things over to a database. And before I do that, let me go ahead and I'm going to fork this space so that I can kind of keep a copy of this, but I'm going to create a new space. So I'm going to fork this, and I'm going to call this to-do list DB. And I'll just click fork. And all that does is just, it kept the other space as it was, but it gives me a new space to work with. So I can kind of see the difference if I needed to. So the first step is to actually create a database. And you'll notice that there's a database tab that you already have within Node Run. And the way that you work with the database is you just kind of click this run SQL function. And if you know the SQL to create your database, you can just kind of code it in there, or if you want to do a select statement, if you've already got some data. If you don't know how to create a database, you can always use like some other tool, a visual tool, and maybe export it out and paste the SQL in here. For what we're doing here, the database is super simple that you can just kind of type this in. So we're just going to create a table called to do. And this is an open parentheses, and then it will only have one field called item, and it will be a varchar field called 50. And by default, this will use a MySQL MariaDB database, but there are ways to configure this to use other databases as well, or when you export that out to your own desktop or something, if you want to connect it to another database. That's all possible here. So when you click run, that goes through the process of creating the database, and I should be able to I should have refreshed it. Actually, let me just go ahead and refresh the entire browser page. What you should be able to see is when you go to the tables, you should be able to see that table in there, and you should be able to see the to-do list table with the item as one of the columns. So once we're there, we've got the database, the very first thing that we can do is we can go out here and we can go and replace that list with a query to the database. So instead of doing that hard-coded list, I can do this PJS query statement. And this is an API that we provide that kind of simplifies sending an SQL to a database. Doesn't matter what kind of database it is, it kind of figures it out. It's whatever is configured for your space. So I'm going to simply do select. So query select star from to do, which is basically says fetch all my to-do records from the database. So that will be how we get the data from the database into the grid. And next, let's work on adding and removing. But before I do this, I'm going to reorganize the code just a little bit. So now that we're adding a little bit of complexity, instead of this being one line, this might be a couple lines of code now. I'm just going to move this over to a separate function. So I'm actually going to copy this statement right here for adding, and I'm going to create a function called add item. And I'll pass into this function a grid, and I'll also pass the new item to add. And paste this in here, and basically it's the same code that we're going to run. And instead of running it in place in here, we're just going to call a separate function. So we're just calling add item, passing display.grid, and passing new item. So I haven't really changed any of the code. I have just moved it down to a separate function so far. But now that I've got a separate function, I can add a second line in here, which will add this entry into the database. So I'm going to go ahead and add an SQL statement. So this is just another PJS query, and it looks like this. Just insert into to do set question mark. And question marks, if you've done this type of SQL development, that's just a parameter marker, a placeholder for a value. So my second parameter to this is the actual record that we're adding, and that is just simply item colon new item. So that little line of code just adds the entry to the database. So I'm going to go ahead at this point and just click Save. And I'm going to try launching the application. So we're not done yet, but we already have some database functionality. And so when I put in clean my room and then click Add, and let's say clean the garage and click Add, what's different now is that if I hit refresh, the items stay because we're now connected to a real database. So the last thing to do in order to finish this up is to implement the remove functionality. And this is going to be similar in a sense to how we did the add functionality. So my first step here will be to reorganize this a little bit. So instead of having this line of code run inline over here, I'm just going to move it to a separate function. And I'm going to call this function remove items. And I'm calling this items rather than item because I'm trying to be a little bit forward thinking. In the current grid, we have that you can only remove one item at a time. But if you wanted to change that to checkboxes, for example, and you might have multiple remove flags. So this will be a function that can do it all. So remove items will just accept a grid, and it will kind of go through that grid and remove all the items that have the remove flag set. So I'm going to paste this in here. And just go ahead and call this function remove items and pass in display.grid. So haven't changed any of the code again. I've just reorganized it at this point. And so now I'm ready to add in the database functionality. And for this, there's going to be this is going to happen in two steps. So the first step is to just retrieve the records that we want to remove. And this can look something like this. Var records to remove equals grid dot filter. And we'll do entry, again, arrow function, syntax, entry, arrow, and then entry dot remove. So that is just a simple way. There we go. That is just a simple way for me to retrieve all the records. If I spelled filter correctly, it would do it. Retrieve all the records that have the remove flag, and then I'll have another line of code that will operate on each one of those records to remove. So I'm going to do records to remove dot for each. And for each one of these records, I'm going to run a PJS query statement that's a delete statement. So delete from to do where item equals this question mark. Again, that's a parameter marker. And what we're deleting is record.item. So I know I went over this statement a little fast, but hopefully it makes sense. We're grabbing all the records to remove, and then for each one of them, we're running this delete statement. I'm going to go ahead and click Save and launch the app in the browser. And let's go ahead and maybe add an item. Prepare presentation. Click Add. And then I'll just remove Clean the Garage. And then click Refresh. And that just verifies that it is truly connected to the database. And one more thing I'll show you. So now the application is complete. When you're working within the Node Run environment, if you're on the Database tab, if at any point in time you wanted to see what's inside my database right now, you can always right-click and you say Query. That just auto-populates the select statement for you, and then you can click Run, and you can see what's in my database at the moment. So I promised this was going to be quick, so hopefully it was quick enough. I'm pretty much done with building the to-do list application.